Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the 107 podcast with myself, Jacob. And unfortunately, my co-host Ash is currently off traveling, so you are stuck with me for now. This is a pre-Australian Grand Prix chat with just myself, and hopefully the stars should be aligning and I will not be on my own, and we will be featuring a special guest at some point on Sunday for the wrap-up of the Australian Grand Prix. So for now, it is currently in the evening. On Friday, we have had FP1 and FP2, and we are back. We are seeing cars on track at an actual Grand Prix weekend, and I could not be more excited. Genuinely, I'm really, really looking forward to this race, even though it does mean I have to get up at stupid o'clock in the morning. That is a reminder, obviously, to set your alarms as early as you need to in order to be up for the Grand Prix. But before you set your alarms, I do want to remind you that if you haven't already, please do support the podcast, subscribe to the podcast on your preferred podcast platform. And be sure to rate the podcast as well if you enjoyed it. Or if you didn't enjoy it, feel free to give us some feedback. We are always looking at ways to improve the podcast and how we go over the season. Any feedback that we do give will only make these episodes better. Hopefully. We'll see. But in terms of running on track, cars, driving in circles, upside down in Australia, so far FP1 and 2... no real surprises for me, in complete honesty. I have seen a couple of things that I'd like to discuss just going into the weekend before we hit quali tomorrow morning, which I will also be waking up early for. And then obviously the race on Sunday. One thing to note is lock in your F1 fantasy as late as you possibly can. I would do it this evening because it locks in just before quali, as far as I'm aware. So that is your reminder now to go and lock in your fantasy lineup. And if you haven't already, please come and join our F1 Fantasy League as well. We didn't do too badly last year. We had some pretty good tips and stuff like that to share across the season as well. So be sure to check in on podcast episodes throughout the year. But please do join us in our league. It's going to be a lot of fun and we would love to see you there. We're also in a couple of other leagues as well. My team name is 107 Papayas. So if you see that team name knocking around anywhere, that'll be me doing horribly or particularly well. Let's wait and see. But I'm super excited for that this season. But yeah, some things that I noted, which also impact fantasy, is number one, it's supposed to be a dry quali and a wet race. Now, this means that teams can either set up for quali and try and have a particularly good quali, or if they know something that the other teams don't, maybe they try and set up for maybe even a dry race. And that will impact the field dramatically. Personally, with rain being the great equalizer, I would probably look to set up my car for rain and just hope that my qualifying performance wasn't completely terrible. That's how I would look at it. But again, I don't have as much detail or information as these Formula One teams. I just have, normal BBC weather app and things like that. But because of the rain during the race, it leads me or makes me want to lean towards saying that the more experienced drivers, especially the ones that are particularly good in the wet, will actually perform better than the rookies. So, especially with Behrman crashing in FP1 and causing a red flag, and also them missing FP2, I don't think he's going to be the best pick for this weekend. He's had a couple of incidents already, which isn't particularly great. Like, he had obviously the great performance in Jeddah, but then his Brazil wasn't particularly good. And then now crashing in FP1. It's not the best start to him for life at Haas in the last couple of outings. And remember, you were only as good as your last race. And so it's going to be a very interesting weekend for him. Obviously, I will reserve judgment properly until he's had a few races under his belt, but I wouldn't be looking for stellar performances from any of the rookies, or I wouldn't expect them, or I wouldn't, If one or two jump out and do surprise you, fantastic, but I wouldn't expect the world from them. So I wouldn't be looking at, an Antonelli podium, let's say. Instead, I'm thinking the more experienced drivers will do better. And before going into the weekend and knowing what the weather was going to be like, I actually had Oscar Piastri to win the race. Home favourite, supposedly the fastest car. And I'm kind of leaning that way, to be completely honest. But I do have to say that I'm going to slightly discount Fernando Alonso. He gave an interview after the day's running where he was very clearly not particularly happy with the car. But drivers like Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, and I'm slightly inclined to say Lando, but I'm not going to say 100% rely on him having a good performance this weekend. I don't know. But those more experienced drivers that are going to do particularly well in the wet, I would also, it depends on the performance of the Kick Sauber, but Hulkenberg could also be a good driver to look at as well in terms of having a strong performance this weekend. And so that's sort of where my head's at. And so originally I did have Piastri on the podium, and I think for me this weekend, unless for some reason Mercedes managed to dial in their car and have a really competitive car, I see it between Ferrari and McLaren, with Red Bull probably pipping Mercedes. If you compare the two driver lineups, it's two rookies versus two, not veterans, but veterans. And I think Max is obviously world champion for a reason, and his performance in Brazil last year is exactly the reason why I'm saying that he will more than likely perform pretty well at this race in the wet. So again, if it rains, it could not rain. It could hold off. I genuinely don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the likelihood, as far as I know, or as far as it seems right now, is that it will be wet weather running. And I think I'm torn between Ferrari and McLaren winning the race. I genuinely couldn't tell you. I would love to see Piastri, P1, or at the very least on the podium. That's something I would really, really love to see. And I feel like 80% confident in that prediction that Piastri would win. 80% confident. I'm just not entirely sure. I think that Lando absolutely has a good chance as well. And I think for me, this is where it gets difficult, because for Lewis and for Charles, Lewis is obviously absolutely fantastic in the wet, obviously. But the problem is that he's in a new Ferrari, and he's still not seemed comfortable in that car yet. But as we all know, rain is a great equalizer. So Hamilton could come back into it. I'm really not entirely sure how that's going to look. But then also, if it rains, you can't discount Max Verstappen from that podium. I mean, the RB21 hasn't looked particularly great so far, but it could actually be pretty good. We haven't really had any running. We've got no races to base this off. No nothing. So I am super, super excited to see how everything happens, or how the running goes this weekend. And yeah, it just is going to be particularly interesting. If you had to really force my hand, I would probably say, in no particular order, Oscar, Lando, Hamilton on the podium, if you really had to push me. The reason why I'm not saying that Lewis would be on the podium is just because I'm not entirely sure how comfortable he will be in that Ferrari just yet, especially not in the rain. He's not driven that Ferrari in the rain, a competitive level type thing. I think he did some laps in Italy, obviously, as like filming and testing, but it's not quite the same. But who knows? He seemed to come into the weekend with a lot of energy. He sort of said that it reminds him of being a rookie from when he first started in 2007 in McLaren, and Australia being his first race weekend. So it's going to be interesting to see how they do. Outside chance, Williams could do potentially pretty well. But again, who knows? Could it have just been that during that FP1 where Carlos was second and I believe Alex was P6? I'm not looking at the data right now. Could it have been that this is, them pushing them pushing P1, them pushing FP1 a lot harder than the other teams? We actually don't know yet. And so that's the thing. We don't really know. The only thing that we know is that theoretically, this McLaren looks pretty good. Theoretically, the Ferrari doesn't look bad either. But we simply don't know. So that's, like I said, my podium prediction. I'm going Piastri, Norris, and Verstappen in no particular order. I could be wrong. If you had to ask me for a winner, I want to say Piastri, but if it's going to be between the two papaya cars, provided that they don't mess up the strategy, it could potentially also be Lando. But I really, really want to see Oscar make that next step this year. After all, I did say if McLaren very clearly have the fastest car over the season, I would look at Oscar being a world champion over Lando at this point. He's shown that he is strong, but it needs to be more consistent. But that is a very early prediction, very, very early. And when Ash gets back, we will do our full season predictions. And because I think by the time he's back, we'll have had maybe 1 or 2 races running. But of course, I'm going to wrap things up there. I've given you my thoughts. Please do like and follow the podcast on your preferred podcast platforms. And then also, please do come and check us out or say hello on Instagram or TikTok or wherever it is you'd like to interact with us. We would love to hear from you. Love to see you join. And also update your fantasy and join our league as well. There will be a link in the description of this on Spotify or YouTube or whatever. And yeah, we hope to see you there. We can't, guarantee any prizes or anything like that, but it's just going to be fun. It'll be fun. So really hoping to see you all. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you on Sunday after the first race of the 2025 season. Cheers, everyone.